Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on the session that's named Aviation Trends and Recovery Tracking. And I'm very happy to have two distinguished guests, some of the key leaders, particularly here in the northwest of Seattle. We have Darren Holst from Boeing, the VP of Commercial Marketing, and Ben Brookman from Alaska Airlines, the Managing Director of Airport Affairs. So we want to make this quite dynamic. Don't think we're going to spend the next 45 to 50 minutes up here just talking amongst us. We're going to make you guys participate. We hope we will have questions, because if you don't, I will come down there and make you ask questions. So if not, I'll ask you questions. So we're going to try and make this as dynamic as possible, particularly that we do have two really important leaders from the industry. So I think they're going to provide some very good insights, and that will lead to some good Q&A. Before we start the dialogue, Darren's going to give us just a short presentation from the Boeing perspective in terms of how the recovery is looking and what Boeing is looking at. So we'll kind of use that as the baseline to start the conversation and the discussion. Over to you.
Oh, sure. Thank you. So let me start with just a quick few charts on the industry and a little bit of perspective. And I think since all of us, or all of you who are here or streaming this, probably are all very passionate about where the industry is, this is not going to be news to many of us, but maybe it just sets a little bit of a perspective on where we are. The first is kind of like a dashboard, you know. So if we look at the lay of the land, there's kind of four metrics that might be relevant in terms of tracking. One is, where is the fleet? Two are, where are the operations? Three, how about the capacity? And four, the traffic. And in normal times, obviously, you're running full productivity in every single metric. But as a result of the pandemic and where the industry is coming back from, each of these metrics are at slightly different levels, or at different points of the recovery, because of where different regions of the world are. And so these metrics are compared to pre-pandemic levels, adjusted pretty closely to the season that we're in as well. And I think the thing to note is the active fleet, the number of aircraft that are active in service, is back above 90%. But traffic, operations, and capacity is still below 90%, in some cases below 80%. And so what that indicates, and just from my perspective, is the industry is continually trying to stay ahead of where the recovery is in terms of being able to react and adjust capacity. The other thing I think it illustrates is, while the airplanes are back in service, resource challenges, continued restrictions in some markets are holding back the true level of recovery that would normally be here from a normal demand perspective. And so, you know, as we move from left to right, you can see that the lagger still remains passenger traffic. That's adjusted for distance, so RPK traffic is, we're estimating, you know, in terms of May, right around 70% of normal, which is a huge improvement over what we've seen in the course of the last year. But still, you know, there's 30% left to go, and a lot of that has to do with markets in Asia, such as the domestic and international Chinese market. This will give you a little bit more perspective on the regional dynamics, because that dashboard was global. This is not my heart rate monitor or an EKG test. However, it does kind of look like it. You can see various regions of the world look very similar. In other words, Latin America, Middle East, North America kind of follow that up and to the right trend of very resilient level of operation. This is not traffic. This is just the level of flights relative to pre-pandemic January 2020. And then you get regions like China, where you see resilience, challenge, resilience, lockdown, and there's still coming out of probably the most severe lockdown this spring that the industry saw in China since the beginning of the pandemic. And with China representing almost 20% of global traffic, somewhere between 17 and 20%, depending on how you measure, that's obviously going to make an impact at the global level. In fact, I would expect IATA's May data will come out within the next week in terms of traffic. And if we take China out, I think domestic traffic around the world will be within 3 or 4% of full recovery, which is amazing. And I think really a testament to the resilience of aviation. But the other thing I wanted to note, and you can obviously see there's lots of data here, is there's still a divergence between short haul and long haul. A lot of that has to do with long haul traffic to and from Asia, because the gap is beginning to close in markets like the transatlantic, where by the time we get to August of this year, the transatlantic market will be within 8-9% of pre-pandemic capacity. Again, amazing resilience in that market, and I think it'll be the leading indicator of how long-haul traffic truly does recover as we move through 2022 and into 2023. And I think the biggest source of continued optimism that I have in terms of the resilience is, as we all know, the biggest single driver of demand for air travel is economic activity. And as we move through the recovery, global GDP is now well above the level that it attained in 2019. And global traffic is still, as I said, somewhere between 60 and 70% of normal. So there's still a gap that needs to be closed just by natural demand as barriers to travel are removed. So even though the industry is facing some headwinds in terms of cost of fuel, inflation, other challenges, the tailwinds of just the overall level of economic activity are the strongest, I think, of all the movement here. And so as some of these regions see more and more opening, we're going to see a pretty rapid acceleration through this year. So by the end of the year, and I think we agree largely with IATA's projections, we'll be above 80% of normal traffic by the end of this year, which is I think a great base for closing that final gap in 2023. And I think that's kind of what I mean here. This is our view of the recovery, which largely aligns with others in the industry, especially IATA. We think that by the end of 2023, the industry fully recovers in terms of RPK traffic. The nuance there is at the global level. Some of the industry regions will be actually above 2019 by the end of next year. Some will still be recovering back towards that level. But I think the important point is, once we get there, now it's about returning to that long-term trend that we've seen over and over and over again, despite the challenges of economic shocks, terrorist attacks, all the different things that has been thrown at the industry over the course of the last few decades. So I wanted, since I'm a ex-network guy, I still am a little bit of a geek in terms of how the industry continues to show its agility. You build 2 kilometers of train tracks, you can't redeploy it. You build 2 kilometers of road, you can't redeploy it. All you need is 2 kilometers of runway, and you can fly that aircraft virtually anywhere around the world. And I think we've seen that over the course of the last 2 years as airline networks have evolved. I talked a little bit about single aisle or regional recovery. 97% of the number of single aisle city pairs that were served in 2019 are served this summer, but they're not the same city pairs. And I think that's a testament to how airline networks have been redeployed. We've seen a loss of somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 city pairs that were flown by single aisle aircraft in 2019. But 3,000 new city pairs have been started, launched, and flown by airlines around the world, to the point where, again, 21% of the single aisle network in just counting city pairs that exists in 2022 is new compared to 2019. I think, for what we think is a mature industry, that's just an amazing amount of growth and resilience. And you're seeing something similar on the long haul or the wide body side. It's just taking longer to truly come to fruition, because so many markets continue to be limited in some way and or still restricted in terms of travel. So in that market, we're still around 75% of the number of city pairs served. However, almost a quarter of the city pairs that are served are new relative to 2019. So even in the long haul market, airlines are finding new ways to optimize networks, to find demand, and to cater to the revenue that exists in the market. So even though we don't have interactive polling, I'm going to pretend like we do. And since we're, flight schedule network geeks, sorry, I'm not making you all geeks, but at least I am. Like, what's the 10 most popular flight numbers in the world that exist out there? I think most of you'd probably say something simple like flight number 1 or something like that. Would you be surprised to know that the most popular flight number is 101? We did a little, schedule analysis, and so you can see the top 10 or top 50. Yeah, I think that's 10 or maybe even more. You can see they're all 3 digits, and most of them end in 1. Surprisingly, flight number 1 is not one of the top city or top flight numbers. Although I know a lot of airlines tend to reserve 1 for the premier, the flagship type route. You can see a lot of these routes, including Seattle Anchorage, use the number 101, which is, I think, again, interesting to watch as the market continues to rebuild itself. The second question is, what are the 10 most popular departure times? To the minute. I think somebody's got to be able to shout out at least one answer before I flip the page here. Anybody want to shout out what's the most popular departure time around the world? In local, not in UTC or anything crazy. 6:30, you're within a half hour. 7 o'clock is by far the most popular departure. This is weighted by frequency. So on a weekly basis, over 7,000 flights are scheduled at 7 o'clock. And if you can see, the top 9 are on the hour. And almost all of them are in the morning. The 10th most popular is 8:30 a.m. And then, of course, I had to show you the least popular. And I did, the right side shows the least popular 10 departure times. But I made sure I didn't count anything between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. because nobody, obviously, in most places wants to fly at those times. The least popular departure time with only 4 weekly frequencies is 10:13 p.m. So if you guys want to start a flight, that's definitely open. I'm sure there's no slot issues in most places. Interesting to check that out. And then, of course, when we think about the long haul market, it's the part of the market that's the slowest to recover. And so what I was curious about is, in every market, even though we have crisis and challenges, there are still some airports and some cities that are actually seeing above pre-COVID, above pre-pandemic level of demand. So there's 10 airports that have the most added seats since 2019. These are the 10 cities, the 10 airports that actually have more service or significantly more service than they had in 2019. And some probably don't shock you. Istanbul, for example, is by far the most in terms of the true volume of the new capacity, same as Delhi. And then you have some really interesting ones like Reunion, or I know I'm not saying that right in French. Also Melbourne, Florida, which had 0 seats, so it's pretty easy to add from 0 because it's the sort of co-terminal now, I guess you could argue, for Orlando. And then you have markets like Athens, a leisure market, Accra, which has more service to the States than it did pre-COVID. And then my favorite, which is in Bangladesh, and I don't even know how to pronounce it, but ZYL, which is Sylhet, has service this summer to Saudi Arabia and London, believe it or not. So if you want to find a new city pair, you can definitely check out that route. And then, forgive me, because I wouldn't be representing Boeing if I didn't actually do one question about commercial. And these are the top aircraft that are serving long-haul city pairs. So I think interesting to note, again, as we move through the recovery and into the future, the focus I guess we could say even for single aisle, any type of aircraft, is versatility. Airlines are looking for, how do I maximize the capability of my network and the flexibility at the lowest risk? And so you're seeing a lot of twin-engine wide bodies that are deployable across a wide range of networks. And I think you see the same thing in the single-aisle market, is how do I maximize my flexibility at the lowest amount of risk? And I think you'll see that continue, and I know a lot of you probably are managing through that. How do I optimize a schedule with the fleet that I have? And so I think it's fascinating to continue to watch the market, and I think it's also demonstrating its resilience over and over. And so as we look at the last 40 years and now project it to the next 5, 10, and 20, I think without without question, I know in 2020 and 2021 we said we think the market's resilient. We're almost sure the market's resilient. I think without question now the market has proven itself once again to be resilient, despite the biggest challenge that the industry I think has ever faced. So I know we're excited to be a part of it, and excited to see the market continue to recover as we move through the rest of this year.
Thank you, Darren. Actually, next time I have a dinner party and I'm planning to have some Trivial Pursuit questions, I'm certainly going to go to you because they were pretty good. Pretty.
I don't have to bring the wine.
No, don't worry, we'll invite you, but pretty good questions there. So let's start it off. Darren, you gave us a good headway in terms of how the market's going, how we're recovering, how agile the industry has been. So, Ben, from your perspective and Alaska's perspective, are you now in recovery? Are you still in recovery mode, or are you now in growth mode? Because every time I read something on the news, you're opening new destinations, you're increasing. So that doesn't necessarily mean you're recovering, but are you?
Yeah, and so thank you for having me. This has been super interesting, actually, and it's always good to talk to Darren. And I would echo a lot of what you said with the recovery. For Alaska specifically, the traffic has largely come back to 2019 levels on a system level. So I would say that from a macro perspective, we are at a point now where we are fully recovered or almost fully recovered. Obviously, we've had a challenging last 6 months, and I think the industry has seen it now with resource constraints and oil prices and all the constraints that we are facing. Overall, we are positioned really well. We've got a great order book that will see us grow about 40% over the next 5 years, and as well as being able to transition our fleet back to an all Boeing fleet, which we're incredibly excited about. But yeah, I would say, this summer we're going to be operating about 1,300 flights a day, and that's equivalent to what we saw in 2019. So as we sit here today on this stage, we are back. Now, that doesn't mean that the network looks anything like what it did before. To your point, we've added a lot of destinations. We've sort of rebaselined our capacity in the Northwest, and we've positioned ourselves to grow in California, kind of coming out of the acquisition of Virgin America. But I think over the next, call it 6 to 8 months, you're going to see us grow as best we can, taking into account the constraints that we have in our business. But I think overall we feel really good about how we're positioned today and where we see the growth going forward.
So let's talk a little bit about what's been lost, because your airline, you're seeing from a market standpoint, you're starting new destinations. You're going to new places that you didn't go before. You decided, I'm going now. But there's still a lot of city pair connections around the world that have not returned. In the U.S., in North America, it's about 394. Latin America, the other part I manage, is about 400 plus. And you have a lot of airports around this facility that are talking to airlines, and they've lost that connectivity. Will it come? And to those places that you served before and you're not doing it now, what will it take for you to get back, and does it really make business sense in an environment where it's all about the bottom line and the number of passengers that I could get on those airplanes?
I think that what we've seen, Alaska's primarily a leisure or a bleisure type market and type airline, and we haven't had the significant drawdown of dots on the map that other airlines, I think, have seen. We've been really focused now. I do think that affects us, though, as a member of the One World Alliance. Especially with our hubs in LA and San Francisco and Seattle, we feed a tremendous amount of traffic into our international carriers, and with that drawdown, we have had to rebaseline some of our flights. And so you've seen us grow in leisure destinations, places like Palm Springs, places like Bozeman, Montana, and pull down capacity that would have traditionally flown into a lot of the international destinations. We've seen that come back, and we've seen it come back very quickly, particularly to Europe, I think, as you noted. And so we're prepared to adjust and be very dynamic. That's probably one of the biggest strengths of our airline, quite frankly, is we are able to deploy capacity quickly. We've been fortunate, and I don't want to say unique, but probably pretty close to it, that we've been able to maintain the overall presence in our markets and just reshuffle the specific dots or lines, on the route map that we're operating.
Darren, from your side, from a Boeing commercial side, how do you see it? How do you see when you talk to other business partners, other customers around the world, and that city connectivity is just in doubt right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think as far as demand is concerned, obviously we're focused on the addressable market for airplanes like the 737 and higher. But what's interesting to me is to see the challenges that exist below that space. And part of it could be resource and pilot driven, where if airlines are going to have to make a choice between serving a route that is a regional jet or turboprop versus preserving mainline connectivity and the revenue that generates, you're seeing airlines make that choice, and that shrinks some of the dots, reduces some of the dots. And I think part of that is something that we as an industry need to help facilitate more pilot training, more resources to satisfy, because I think that's a restraint or constraint and not a demand issue, if that makes sense. From our perspective, as far as demand has come, I think last year, U.S. and North American airlines were starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel because of the resilience in the domestic market. And so they made orders for single-aisle jets. This year, it's moving into Europe and even parts of Asia. And I think that's airlines getting more confidence in how they can rebuild their networks. But regarding your question on city pairs, I go back to the whole agility thing. Airlines in the U.S. were remarkable in how they switched from business to leisure focus with their networks almost overnight in 2020. Some airlines have switched back partially, to your point, Ben. Some airlines have switched back almost fully because all of a sudden they're seeing the business demand, and some are kind of hedging and saying, how can I get the best of both worlds? And I think then you're running into making decisions on scarce resources, and then you have to figure out, where am I going to cut this capacity, or how do I manage it? However, a healthy economic market, a strong demand for destination travel is going to find capacity sooner or later, because there's just too much opportunity.
I would just add, too, we've seen some pretty creative solutions in the last 12 months from airlines on how to solve some of these regional issues, right? Whether it's, transitioning fleet types, or even in some cases the bus services that we're now seeing with American and United, right? And so I'm an optimist. I think these problems are going to be solved, whether they are through, additional mainline flying single or figuring out a new pilot construct on the regional side, or even an entirely different type of mode of transportation. But overall, I think the market is very dynamic, and we have been able to figure out how to serve those guests in those cities.
And we talk about how dynamic the U.S. market is. North American carriers will be at least our latest forecast, will be the only region in this year that will actually be in the black. So the U.S. industry in North America, also including Canada, will actually make money this year, whereas the rest of the world is still in catch-up mode, trying to get in the red. Obviously, challenges. The other aspect we were talking about is in terms of restrictions and how we see borders opening, and where, particularly in this post-COVID, as we come out of COVID, those governments that have pretty much eliminate any sort of quarantine restrictions, people are going to flock. People are going to fly, and we're seeing that on a global basis and how quickly the recovery is taking place. You guys have talked a little bit about single-aisle airplanes, and we're going to talk about infrastructure. I was kind of thinking, what do I talk first? Infrastructure of these airplanes. Boeing, Airbus done a great job in bringing airplanes that can now fly 7-8 hours and long-haul flights. Is these type of airplanes going to be a deterrent in slot-regulated airports, where right now you're controlled with the big boys, the 380s, the 777s, and now you have 321s and 737 MAX trying to get into these markets, which, as customers you want to, because now, you have JetBlue or TAP flying their A320s across the water into New York. It's going to be a challenge. And, we haven't talked about the infrastructure yet, but how does that impact you guys in the future? But how do you see it? I'll start with you, Darren. It's a challenge. And I don't know about my slots people. They're probably thinking, why is he even asking this question? But when you look at Heathrow, when you look at New York, when you look at some of these airports, and we're seeing more of these airplanes coming online, they're going to be a game changer for the whole entire industry. How do we go about that?
Yeah, I think we could talk for an hour just on that segment of the market.
Do we have it now?
because
Happy hours at what time?
I
Six,
might.
okay.
I don't know if a happy hour would help or hurt this conversation. I think that the market that you're talking about, 7, 8, whatever hour single aisle flights, it's the game changing. I think is maybe an extreme terminology. Because I do think it's still a relative niche in the market. But it's cool to talk about because it's a new capability that airlines didn't have before or didn't have as widely before. We're seeing, airlines fly Reykjavik, Seattle, for example, with the 737s or, Toronto, Dublin, or, things like that. One thing I wonder, though, is will we see it in a big way at big airports, or are we going to see it more as a secondary market connector, which maybe has less implications on slots? I do think, to your point, though, and that's where why I would contest maybe the game changer term for this airplane. I think it's a cool use of a single aisle capability. I don't know that it's going to be an overwhelming use because, the longer we see, these medium and longer haul flights with single aircraft, the more you realize there's a trade-off between, the cost of the trip and the limitation on things like cargo and other parts that are a huge element of the revenue as you go longer haul. And with single aisle aircraft, you're just not carrying cargo. Cargo is such an important part of the global net. As we've seen, it's sort of carried the industry over the last 18 months, and that's not part of the calculus when you're operating a single aisle aircraft. So I kind of think these airplanes will largely stay kind of on the fringes of the markets, and things like sustainability costs, just the value of a slot in a very dense airport like Heathrow might keep them out of the market on a large scale. We're going to see, we'll definitely see a JetBlue flight or, like you said, a TAP flight into JFK. But are we going to see 50 or 20? I don't know, because I think you start to play that cost versus revenue game, and you start to have to generate a significant yield premium for those. Yeah. So I think I'm fascinated by it personally, but I just don't know how big that network's going to be.
Yeah, and it is interesting because you see a TAP and Iberia that will look into maybe going to Montreal, Toronto.
Sure.
They don't serve today. And then you speak to Ryanair or Southwest, and they swear they'll never do it.
Never.
But never is a long time.
Yeah, I mean.
And, no one ever expected that to happen,
2 words that you should never say in aviation are never and always.
So, you never know when Ryanair says, you know what, I like Europe, or Wizz, and all of a sudden you begin to see them flying across the Atlantic.
No question.
Okay, so anything from your
because
no,
it's
you're single aisle. You're not going to.
We are, so I have to be a little careful about what I say.
And again, not necessarily focus in big markets. You could go deep into South America or other places.
It's something that actually, I think the conversation around slots and infrastructure go hand in hand. The reality is this is something that my team is dealing with on a daily basis, and it's something that we do need to prepare for. Whether these narrow-body long-haul flights are on the fringe always. I don't actually know the answer to that, but I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is what sort of systems do we need to put into place to allow to have a prioritization for aircraft types? We work with this stuff all the time in various locations, and what's the funnel for who gets that spot? And certainly gauge, I think, should play a part in it when we think about the highest and best use of these rare assets, which are becoming more and more rare, whether they're slots or gates or runway or airspace. Irrespective of what the actual constraint is, we need stronger mechanisms around how we choose who is able to operate these things. And gauge has to become a bigger part of it than what it is today.
So based on that, let's throw a little bit of a bomb in there. Yeah, I always say, IATA runs these slots, and I'm always thinking, slots. Slots is actually bad. And I have a whole team of slots people here and said, this guy's going to get me out of a job. But when you look at it, pre-pandemic, the industry was growing like hell. You looked at every region, major improvements, people traveling more than ever. And the biggest factor was infrastructure. We hit COVID, kind of goes dark, and now we're going again in strong recovery mode. And we see in many parts of the world, we've had a significant infrastructure improvement plan throughout the U.S. We've seen major enhancements. But for the most part, we are struggling on a global basis with infrastructure. More airplanes are being manufactured. Airlines are buying more. There's more connectivity than ever before. We're opening new markets even in this COVID age. And our infrastructure is not improving. We're not building new runways. We're not enhancing the terminal areas. I see it in the region I'm responsible. In Latin America, North America, we didn't have the issue of slots for many years. Now it's a recurring theme in every country we go to. Is this the norm for the future? Or how are we going to convince our airport operators and governments that we really need to build? Because at some point, you're not going to be able to build more airplanes because they're going to be on the ground because we can't get them anywhere. You're not going to be able to expand and bring more connectivity because we just can't get in. What's the challenge? What's the challenge going to be? What's the norm? And what's the solution? Does anyone have
Ben
a
has the
solution
answer.
out there? If you do, you come right up here. We'll give you a seat.
No, I agree. I think this is the new normal. I think when you look at the level of investment that's occurred, certainly domestically, over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been pretty negligible as far as actually expanding meaningfully the capacity at our airports. I'm super happy that the infrastructure bill is what it is, and we've been able to make serious progress on it, but it takes a long time to turn the ship. I think we will see results, at least in the U.S., over the next 3 to 5 years that will be meaningful. I think the question that we need to figure out is, will it actually even keep up with travel demand? I don't know the answer to that. And the other thing too is just making sure that these assets have fair access. For a smaller carrier, in Alaska, you go outside the country and we have 300 airplanes, and it sounds like a lot, but in the U.S. it's relatively small. So even for an airline like Alaska, the fifth largest in the country, we don't always have the level of access to these constrained airports that a lot of the larger carriers do. And so these investments need to be guided by all the airlines at the airport and done so in a responsible way. The other side of this thing too is airport costs. We can't be at a place where we're investing so much that it becomes uneconomic for passengers, because then it doesn't matter anyway. So it's a very, very, very fine balance. We've certainly have not invested as we've needed to in the last 30 years. We're making good progress, but I think this continues probably until I've retired.
Does it worry you at Boeing?
I mean, in some ways, yes. I think, to your point, natural traffic demand could be constrained if limitations are strong enough in terms of the facilities. We've seen it in parts of the world already. What I've been encouraged by outside the U.S. is investment in places like India in more infrastructure, because 5 years ago, slots were a huge concern, and not that they aren't today, but there's movement towards more runways, more terminal facilities, more progress that I think is going to enable the market to grow as it should. So ultimately, I think, going back to what we talked about in terms of constraints today, in terms of resources, and most of those are human resources, I think if we have the right long view, I think those constraints get removed. However, you've got questions around what that does to future airplanes. If you ultimately see growth being constrained by whether it's airspace, gates, or runways, then does that change the future of how airplane designed, or maybe the density on board aircraft, or maybe a combination of those things? Or does it change business models, in terms of disaggregating some of the hub networks that we see today to the point where we see, when I worked at Delta, we were getting rid of secondary hubs. Will we see those come back because of how you can connect people through systems because of those constraints? And I think those are open questions. And again, our focus, from an since you can't just point and design an airplane every year or two, or even in some cases every decade. You want to make sure that you give airlines the most versatile asset that can be used across any of these strategies as the market evolves, because it shows that it can adapt. And I think that's the key for me, is making sure that the airplanes are adaptable, because policies will change, demand environments will change, and ultimately I think these issues get solved, but it might take time.
I do want to open it up to if there's any questions or any comments based on, oh, I see a hand. He was very quick.
That's very loud, sorry. Owen McLaughlin here from Dublin Airport. I just have a comment and a question. So the first comment is on the single aisle narrow body, the long haul. My thoughts on them are that they're actually key for the future, but there's a number of factors. It depends on where you are. Once you move out of those super congested airports, these become really, really key, right? And the fact that you can have 2 aircraft on a Mars stand versus one wide body. So you could have actually more capacity in the airport there by doing it, and it opens up more O&Ds. And yeah, I just think from the perspective, geography comes into it as well. It mightn't be good for some airports. For ourselves in Dublin, it's actually really key. And if you think of carbon footprints and stuff like that, you're reducing passengers possibly going through hubs and through circuitous routes and things like that. So you're actually getting them to places they want to go. So I think there's a load of positives from that. And my question was, you talked about basically being back to 2019 levels at the end of 2023. Have you considered inflation, higher fuel costs, less money in people's pockets towards the end of this year and into next year and things like that? That will obviously have a huge impact. Airfares are going to go up. I've no money in my pocket, so I can't actually buy them. I'm not going to be doing the second weekend breaks that I used to do and things like that.
The short answer is yes, we have considered that, and that actually is a headwind. Otherwise, we probably would say that the market would be recovered a little bit sooner. I think the question that remains kind of a key item to continue to debate and observe is how durable the inflation and those challenges that exist. If inflation's 8, whatever, 9 in some countries % and continues to persist at that level for over a year, yeah, I mean, it's probably going to change our forecast because you start getting negative returns on disposable income and things like that. But I think our view is still that it's somewhat transitory, that some of these things kind of settle out as we move through the rest of this year. But I think it's a good question. I do think the level of resilience we've already seen in the market is giving us enough confidence to say by the end of 2023, in most markets, we'll be above where we were, and there'll be still some markets that are gradually returning. The places where I'm the most bullish, frankly, are advanced economies because of the level of pent-up demand and pent-up savings we saw. Emerging economies, clearly long-term, the growth, no question. The challenge is with a stronger dollar, higher interest rates, that does create a drag in the near term on the ability to afford travel, and I think that does create a little bit of a concern in the short term.
And that is very similar to our forecast, particularly on the dollar to fuel issue, where in most foreign countries, airlines have to pay their fuels in USD. So you have a strong strong dollar and a rising fuel cost.
Yeah, it's like a double whammy on
that. Double whammy on that. Sure. And that's where the U.S. carriers in this moment have somewhat of an advantage from financial.
Well, right. And so your question is valid because, I mean, going back to the always never statement, if you say that the revenue environment in the U.S., which is amazingly strong, try to book a flight on any airline, and congrats on some of these fares. But if we say there's always going to be demand at these fare levels, I think that's a question too. I think people have the money now; they need to travel now, they want to travel now. Longer term, I think the balance between cost and demand is really important. And I think we need to see that inflation kind of settle, the fuel price settle, and ultimately airlines are going to be able to set that price at a mutually kind of, you know, at an equilibrium point, which is sustainable over time.
To your point on the single aisle, I agree with you. I think it's going to be a game changer. It's going to be a game changer from primary to secondary. I see it in many parts of the world that you're beginning to see that. And because of the hubs being so packed, people don't want to go through hubs anymore. Also, we see it now with the U.S. carriers in particular. They've opened a lot of summer routes because they had airplanes on the ground. And they said, let's take the chance. And I think those future routes, or those routes will in the future be used by single aisle airplanes. So I do see it as a huge opportunity where, you know, I'm from Spain, I'm from Mallorca, which is a very heavily populated European destination. Never did you ever have a U.S. carrier fly there. And actually United started flying there. 767, it won't fly 767 forever. And it's only there for the summer season. But you never know what will happen in the future, that when they do have a MAX or a long A321, instead of just doing the summer, you do it from spring to fall. And then you start looking at other markets. So I think secondary markets with that type of airplane is really going to give a lot of dynamics.
Especially if you're in Dublin or Mallorca.
Yeah, exactly.
Because those geographies are fantastic.
Yeah,
for somebody.
absolutely. And you'll see in many other places in Latin America and in Asia as well, where you can really take advantage of big hubs, but going to secondary destinations, or secondary to another area. Any other questions? Don't be shy. No? All right, we're coming to the end. One of the things so we talked about infrastructure, we talked about slots, we talked about airplanes. You can't run an airport, you can't fly an airline without staff. And that is becoming, and we talked about fuel, so we have that one covered. So staff is becoming a really big issue. We see it on the airline side where, you know, they're having to significantly reduce their capacity. Actually, in the U.S., some airlines have been proactive. They reduced their capacity for the summer because they didn't want to go through what we went through in Christmas time. In Europe, we're seeing, you know, airlines actually decide not to fly certain times of the day or the week because of the staff issue. In Canada, we're being actually encouraged by the government to reduce capacity in the summertime. That's typical government, not, you know, don't, you know, you do it in the high peak? No, they want to really give us a headache. But it is an issue. So how do you guys see that? Because that's a boomerang that's hitting us with a big whammy over the summer.
Yeah, it is, and it's frankly affected us pretty dramatically in April and May. I think there's a couple of critical solutions. One, airlines have got to get better at planning for staffing, right? And you've seen that now with pretty much every airline in the U.S. just having trouble keeping up with the demand. Now, granted, you know, we are growing 35% year over year, right, to get back to 2019 levels. It is still a huge lift. I don't think that there's certainly, we can always talk about policy changes and other near-term solutions that would help alleviate the problem. I think at the end of the day, this is a very long-term solve, and one in which we need to start bringing in people at a much younger age to get involved in the industry, to understand what career opportunities exist and sort of own that process. I think one of the most interesting things that I've seen is the Denver airport, for example, is investing tremendously in essentially an aviation academy that takes kids in and educates them about jobs at the airport, not just pilots, but also mechanics and jobs at the airport, and shows that there is a clear career path for people coming in. And this is not a solution that we're going to have in 6 months, but it is going to be something that 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to be very grateful that we set up these programs. Like I said, not just for, and give people a career path. You know, at Alaska, most of our officers at the operational level started on the ramp. And that's the kind of pathways that we need to be clear exist and help bring people in and show that these are good careers. But it starts really early, and it needs investment at the education level, and it takes time.
From your part, Darren, what you see, I imagine at Boeing you've had some challenges as well. Will this, you know, the issue here is, where will the staff go? Will they go to the better payer, the opportunity? Right now, we don't have the folks, the people out there. Now, there was just a work fair in Singapore to try to attract personnel to Singapore, and they went out to the neighboring countries in Southeast Asia. 1 week later, Australia did exactly the same thing. So it's going to become a global competition on trying to attract that limited amounts of staffing, expertise to the industry. How do you see it from your standpoint? And again, will this become the single most important issue that the industry faces?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have the perfect answer. I would say it is the most near-term challenge, regardless of where you are in the industry. As a manufacturer, it absolutely has been a challenge in terms of how we have adjusted our production rates. It's a factor in our supply chain because we're only as good as the supplier that we have and their human resources. It's because their ability to ship on time the parts that we need to build the aircraft can determine if we're able to complete or not the aircraft. And so it's the whole ecosystem, I think, that has to adapt. And when you go down and up as fast as we saw, I think you see the challenges that creates. I think longer term, if you look at specific sectors of staffing, I mean, pilots, it's huge because it takes time to you can't just turn it on. I mean, some of the parts of the industry, it takes a month or two to train somebody. Pilots, in the U.S. it takes 1,500 hours to 1,500 flight hours. So that's not something you generate overnight. And so I think that investment is going to take time to come to fruition, and we need to plan for it. I think I'd go back to what Ben said though earlier, which is the passion for aviation, and the excitement of being in the aviation industry is a huge part of it. And you want people to think of it as a career, not just a job, and Boeing's one example of a company where, man, you can work in a lot of different places over the course of a 20, 30-year career and always be challenged and always be moving around. Alaska's, in an airline, I started on the ramp in Grand Rapids, Michigan, GRR, and ended up in Atlanta and ended up here because, it's an industry where you can have a lot of opportunity, but you have to provide it and illustrate it and demonstrate it and show people that there's a huge opportunity and it's exciting to be a part of. And so I think part of it's passion, part of it's just pure investment in resources and lowering the barriers to entry, because there's so many people that could be fantastic pilots if we lowered the cost of entry and enabled some of these skilled resources to be trained in a much more cost-effective way.
One last thing before we end on one item, government. We are seeing a huge amount of government engagement, to put it politely, intervention, to put it less politely, and just grossly trying to control the industry. Particularly when you look at the infrastructure side, the slots issues, how much is it a risk that we begin to see governments around the world trying to implement their own capacity regimes in place, that it can also be another deterrent in terms of growth? Are you seeing it? You're much bigger in the U.S. You do fly to Latin America and other parts. You're seeing it from a global standpoint. We're seeing all these now because of lack of capacity, because of infrastructure, because airlines are growing. Governments are now saying, let me take a little bit more control. Airlines, you're not always well behaved. How do you guys see that?
I mean, I can start. I think from my perspective, I'll just go to the pandemic. I mean, we can talk about other issues, but the fact that there wasn't a coordinated approach to travel, and now since we saw the resilience of the market despite the challenges, I think one thing it shows governments, if they're willing to sort of take a look at this objectively, is look at how important aviation is to the functioning of the global economy. Supply chains broke. Air cargo helped fix it. People needed to make connections for commerce, for family, for trade, for just resuming business links, and ultimately being face-to-face is a great healer, of what ails some of the world. And once you realize how important it is to connect yourself to the global economy, you're like, oh my goodness, we need to figure out a way to enable it. And I think the reality of how important aviation is such an important factor that we need to help educate, in some cases gently, on. But I mean, help remove the barriers, but not remove any safety issues or any issues that could cause challenges. Because the more efficient the system works, the better off everybody, all the stakeholders are in the process. And I think I think you used some great adjectives. If you don't think about it from the benefits of what aviation brings, then you could actually send not only aviation in the wrong direction, but ultimately the direction of the economy.
Ben, you agree?
100%. And I think at the end of the day, the role of government, of course, has a place in aviation. It needs to, from a safety perspective. And almost as importantly, is just making sure that competition still exists and airlines have access to what they need. And I do agree that there's always risk of any action, whether it's government or other, of having unintended consequences that actually, stifle competition and increase prices. I think it's important for us to be constantly communicating what we think those risks are or those consequences might be, and then also supporting, quite frankly, where there are instances where we can be safer or where there is greater access or greater ability to compete. Right now, it is challenging, just based on what we've talked about before with the nature of the infrastructure constraints. So I would totally echo that.
Ben, Darren, we could have been here another hour. It's gone
let's go.
pretty fast, pretty fast. Unless there's any questions, dying questions, comments? Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having
Appreciate
us.
it.
Thanks.
Thank you.